History is full of wars fought for grand and noble causes. This is not a video about those wars. Today, we are looking at the 6 most ridiculous, petty, and downright absurd conflicts ever fought. We have got a war that was over before breakfast, a war started by a single severed ear, an army so confused that it attacked itself in the dark, and a deadly international standoff caused by one very unlucky pig. These are 6 completely real wars that prove humans will fight over absolutely anything. Let's get into it. Let's start with the shortest war in all of recorded history. In 1896, the British Empire and the African island of Zanzibar went to war, and the entire thing was over in under 40 minutes. Here is what happened. The Sultan of Zanzibar, who was friendly with the British, suddenly died. Within hours, his cousin, a man named Khalid bin Bargash, seized the palace and declared himself the new Sultan, without British approval. The British were not amused. They issued an ultimatum, demanding that he step down by 9 o'clock the next morning. Khalid refused and barricaded himself inside the palace with around 3,000 defenders and a few antique cannons. At exactly 9 o'clock, the British Royal Navy opened fire. The palace was bombarded relentlessly, and Khalid fled almost immediately. Just 38 minutes later, it was all over. The new Sultan's flag was shot down, and around 500 Zanzibari defenders had been killed, while the British suffered a single wounded sailor. And that is how you lose a war in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom. Next up, a war named after a body part. In 1731, a British ship captain named Robert Jenkins claimed that Spanish coast guards had boarded his vessel, accused him of smuggling, and sliced off his ear. The story goes that Jenkins kept the severed ear, pickled in a jar. For years, tensions had been simmering between Britain and Spain over trade in the Americas. Then, in 1738, Jenkins was reportedly summoned before the British Parliament, where he dramatically presented his preserved ear as evidence of Spanish brutality. The public was outraged. The newspapers whipped the nation into a fury, and within a year, Britain declared war on Spain. The conflict became known, somewhat mockingly, as the War of Jenkins Ear. And this was no minor scuffle. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, eventually merging into a much larger European conflict, and it involved tens of thousands of troops across the globe. Thousands of men died in a war that was, at least on paper, started by one man's pickled ear. This next one might just be the most embarrassing military disaster of all time. In 1788, the Austrian army was at war with the Ottoman Empire. One night, a large Austrian force was marching near the town of Cambyses. Some scouts crossed a river first and bought alcohol from local villagers. When other soldiers arrived and demanded a share, a heated argument broke out. And then, someone fired a shot. In the chaos and the darkness, a soldier shouted a warning. Somehow, the panicked, exhausted, and now drunk troops became convinced that the enemy Ottomans were attacking them. Soldiers began firing wildly into the dark, and because the Austrian army was made up of many different nationalities, commands shouted in different languages only added to the confusion. Entire units started firing on each other, mistaking their own comrades for the enemy. The army descended into total chaos and fled, trampling and shooting one another in the night. When the actual Ottoman army arrived a couple of days later, they reportedly found thousands of dead and wounded Austrian soldiers. The mighty Austrian army had been devastated, entirely by itself. In 1859, the United States and the British Empire very nearly went to war over the death of a single pig. The trouble took place on San Juan Island, a small piece of land off the coast between what is now Washington State and Canada. Both countries claimed the island, and settlers from both nations lived there uneasily, side by side. Then, one day, a British-owned pig wandered into an American farmer's garden and started eating his potatoes. The furious American shot and killed the pig. When British authorities threatened to arrest him, the American settlers called for military protection. Before long, both sides began rushing in soldiers and warships. Soon, there were hundreds of American troops and several British warships, carrying thousands of men, all facing off over a dead pig. Tensions were sky high. But here is the remarkable part. Cooler heads eventually prevailed, and neither side wanted to fire the first shot over a farm animal. After weeks of tense standoff, both sides backed down. In the end, the only casualty of the entire pig war was the pig. For our next story, we go all the way back to ancient Egypt, around 525 BC. The Persian king Cambyses II was preparing to invade Egypt, and he knew his enemy very well. The ancient Egyptians worshipped cats. To them, the cat was a sacred animal, connected to the goddess Bastet. Harming a cat, even by accident, could be punishable by death. So, according to the ancient writer Polyaenus, Cambyses came up with a devious plan for the Battle of Pelusium. He ordered his soldiers to paint the image of the cat goddess onto their shields, and, the story claims, he had his army drive cats and other sacred animals in front of his troops as they advanced. The Egyptian soldiers were horrified. They could not fire their arrows for fear of striking the sacred cats, and harming the animals would damn their very souls. Paralyzed and unwilling to fight, the Egyptian defense crumbled, and the Persians won a crushing victory. Cambyses had conquered an entire kingdom by weaponizing their love of cats. Finally, the war where two American states nearly came to blows over a strip of swampy land. In the 1830s, the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan both claimed a 400-square-mile region known as the Toledo Strip. The land included the city of Toledo, which sat on a potentially valuable shipping route. Both sides were furious. So in 1835, both Ohio and Michigan raised militias, hundreds of armed men, and sent them marching toward the disputed border, ready for a fight. And then, almost nothing happened. The two armies never actually managed to find each other in the dense wilderness. The only real violence of the entire Toledo War was a minor scuffle in which a man stabbed a sheriff with a penknife. No one died. Eventually, the federal government stepped in with a compromise. Ohio was given the Toledo Strip, and Michigan, as a consolation prize, received a remote, frozen chunk of land called the Upper Peninsula, which later turned out to be incredibly rich in valuable minerals and timber. Michigan lost the war, but it arguably won the peace. And there you have it. 6 wars that prove people will pick a fight over just about anything. A pickled ear, a hungry pig, a strip of swamp, and an entire army that managed to defeat itself. History is not always grand and heroic. Sometimes it is just gloriously, hilariously petty. If you enjoyed this trip through history's silliest conflicts, then hit that subscribe button because there is so much more weirdness still to cover. And tell me down in the comments which of these wars you thought was the most ridiculous. I'll see you in the next one.